Today, guys, we're going to be focusing on the Pythagorean theorem. You've probably heard of this before. In order to use the Pythagorean theorem, we always have to focus on a right triangle. So this perpendicular symbol right here focuses on that we have a right triangle. You'll always notice across from the right angle is always something called the hypotenuse, and we've talked about this before. Then you're going to notice that there's going to be kind of something called a long leg here, and there's going to be something called a short leg. And most people will just say that basically there's the hypotenuse and there's two legs. The reason I've designated these as long leg and short leg is because that designates the lengths of the sides. The hypotenuse is always the longest side of a right triangle. The hypotenuse, again, is always the longest side of a right triangle, then the long leg, and then finally the short leg is the smallest. The reason this is important is because there's a relationship between the side length and the angle. The longer the side, such as the hypotenuse being the longest side, associates with the 90-degree angle being your largest angle. If I was to call this would be the smallest angle here because it's across from the shortest leg. This is kind of the one in between, so we'll call it the medium, which is across from the long leg. So there's definitely a relationship between the longest side and the largest angle, the shortest side, smallest angle. And again, medium and medium is also what's going on. Okay, it's important for you to recognize and be able to talk about the legs of the triangle and also the hypotenuse. There was a guy named Pythagoras who came up with the Pythagorean theorem, and what he basically said is in a right triangle, the sum, which means addition, the sum of the squares, which means we're going to square stuff, of the lengths of the legs, those are the things that we're going to square, the legs, is equal to, that means equals, the square, again we're going to square something, the length of the hypotenuse. So what we're going to do is we're going to add together the squares of the legs, and that's going to be equal to the square of the hypotenuse. This is what he meant, and we're going to keep using this over and over and over again as we go along. It says give the lengths of the two legs of the right triangle, find the length of the hypotenuse. So we're going to start with this. In the future lessons, we're going to actually work backwards, given the hypotenuse in one of the legs, find the other leg. We'll work with this later. They'll say to show all your work and circle your final answers. Round your answers to the nearest tenth. This is if necessary. A lot of times we'll get an exact answer, and sometimes what we'll do is we'll get some sort of decimal. I think it's important for us to focus on a formula. So for us, this is going to be legs squared plus legs squared equals the hypotenuse squared. And most times I'm going to abbreviate this with L's and H's. We'll identify this is our right angle, makes this our hypotenuse over here. So what we have is we have 6 squared plus 8 squared equals h squared. 6 squared is 36 plus 64 is going to equal h squared. I'll combine the like terms here. This would be 100 equals h squared. In order to get h by itself, what I'll do is I'll take the square root of both sides, and the square root of 100 is 10. So my hypotenuse, the h, is going to equal 10. And I look up here to focus on the units. My hypotenuse is going to be 10 units. What I see a lot of students do is they'll actually stop at this step here. They'll just say that h, or h squared, equals 100, which is technically correct, but you need to move down to this final step here to say that h is going to be 10 inches. For the second one, it's very similar here. These are our two legs. This is our hypotenuse, which is across from our 90-degree angle. We'll use L squared plus L squared equals h squared. Some teachers will go ahead and use the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And sometimes that gets confusing, especially on ACT tests, where they might label some of these sides or angles A, B, and C, and it might not necessarily associate with your formula. So if you just recognize mathematically that we're dealing with a leg squared, and it's going to be equal to the hypotenuse when you add them together, you should be safe. So again, we'll say 9 squared plus 40 squared is going to equal whatever our hypotenuse is squared. 9 squared is pretty easy. It's just 81. To square 40, I'm going to focus it on just being 4. 4 squared is 16, and when I square a two-digit number like that, it's going to turn out to be 1600 equals h squared. When I add these together, that's going to be 1681 equals h squared. I'll take the square root of both sides to get the h by itself. And if I just put that into my calculator, I'll simply get 41 is the length of my hypotenuse. Again, I'll look up here to see that I'm working with meters. I'll make sure to put the m there. It's always good to measure to have the right units. The next ones are going to work really similarly, so I'll just say leg squared plus leg squared equals my hypotenuse squared. This is my right angle, so this is my hypotenuse, which is across from it. That's 5 squared plus 12 squared should equal my hypotenuse squared. That's 25 plus 144 equals h squared. I'll add these terms together. I should get 169 equals h squared. And if you've been working on your perfect squares, you'll recognize that quickly to be 13. So my hypotenuse is 13 feet. Next, this is my right angle. So this over here is my hypotenuse. If I use L squared plus L squared equals h squared, that's going to be 7 squared plus 24 squared equals h squared. 7 squared is 49. 24 squared should be 576 equals h squared. If you add these together, you should get 625 equals h squared. Again, to get the h by itself, I'll take the square root of both sides, and that gives me h equaling 25. I'll look up here for my units, 25 kilometers. Next, this is going to be our right angle here, which means across from it will be our hypotenuse. We'll write down our formula really quick to make sure that we're showing our work. This will be 8 squared plus 15 squared equals h squared. That would be 64 plus 225 equals h squared. That means 289 equals h squared. I'll take the square root of both sides in order to get h by itself. That means that h will equal 17 centimeters. Number 6 again is really similar. We'll say L squared plus L squared equals h squared. I think if you write this formula down enough, you'll actually have it memorized and be able to recall it a lot easier. This would be 11 squared plus 60 squared equals h squared. 11 squared is just 121. Again, if I square the 6, I'll get 36. When I square something with a tens digit, that should be just 2 zeros, and that should equal h squared. That'll give me 3721 equals h squared. I'll still go about the same process of taking the square root of both sides in order to get the h by itself, and luckily I have my calculator handy and can figure out that this is going to be 61 millimeters. Our last two problems might not come out to be perfect numbers like the rest of them have been. Just remember that here's our right angle. Across from this will be our hypotenuse. We'll still continue to use the same formula. We'll say 12 squared plus 15 squared equals our hypotenuse squared. 12 squared is 144. 15 squared is 225. That should equal our hypotenuse squared. When I add these two numbers together, I'll get 369 equals h squared. I'll take the square root of both sides. And in this case, h isn't a perfect number, so I'm going to go up here. I'm going to make sure that I round to my nearest tenth. With my calculator, to the nearest tenth, this should be 19.2, and these will be deca or decimeters. Lastly here, we actually have an isosceles triangle. This will be our h. We'll still use L squared plus L squared equals h squared. That'll be 6 squared plus 6 squared equals h squared. This is going to be a special right triangle. We'll find more of those properties out in a later lesson. If I add these two numbers together, I should get 72 equals h squared. When I take the square root of both sides, in my calculator I should get h is approximately 8.5 miles. A lot of people have a hard time abbreviating miles. Some people will just say that it's m, which is actually meters. You can either write miles out or just abbreviate it. mi is usually sufficient. Again, we're working with the Pythagorean theorem. For the Pythagorean theorem, again, remember that we're just working on making sure that we can recognize where the hypotenuse is and that we're dealing with two legs. This is a really good formula for you to have memorized.